Well, what?
That's as loud as you could crack it. It's just a noisy yak.
That's the sleepy sign.
Welcome to the Radical Parenting Podcast. My name is Tony Shawcross.
I'm Kara Poorbaugh.
The Radical Parenting Podcast is based loosely on the work of Brad Blanton, who wrote a book called Radical Parenting after he had written a bestseller called Radical Honesty. Kara and I met in Greece in what year?
2013.
So about 7 years ago, Kara and I met in Greece at a Radical Honesty retreat. And when I went to that retreat, it was a 7 or 8 day retreat. I had actually not even read his book, Radical Honesty, which is what drew most people to the retreat. I had only read his book, Radical Parenting, which was given to me by a friend, Lindsay St. Antoine, who's now the CEO of Radical Honesty, as of, I think, like today. Did you hear about that, Kara?
Yeah, I just saw that.
Yeah.
I didn't know. Lindsay gave you that.
A couple times a month, once a week, we're going to have this Radical Parenting podcast, and we're going to talk about ideas that fit into radical parenting, radical honesty. We'll be talking to other parents who we think follow a lot of these ideas, which we'll explain in a little bit more depth. Other parents from the radical honesty community and just people who we think kind of reflect that. We'll also be reading books and giving kind of like book reviews on books that fit this, and also children's books that we think are a really good fit for radical parenting. I should mention I was wanting originally to name the podcast the Prime Directive Parenting. I grew up a Star Trek fan. Kara and I both watched a little bit of Star Trek The Next Generation. And in Star Trek canon, the Prime Directive is non-interference. It's letting these planets that the Enterprise and the Star Trek crew would go and visit that are usually less developed than them, allowing them to kind of develop without interference, really. So I really liked that name. Brad Blanton didn't like that name. He preferred that we call the podcast the Radical Parenting Podcast. So I deferred to his wisdom.
Nice.
Anything you want to say to introduce yourself? Kara's in North Carolina. I'm in Denver.
Yeah, I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I have a 4-year-old daughter who is brilliant and charming and difficult and strong-willed and feisty. I got a feisty 4-year-old, almost 5-year-old. I'm a radical honesty trainer also. I lead groups here in Asheville. And I have this sort of dream of doing some kind of parent groups or parent coaching, even when I feel like I have my head out of the water. And yeah, it's just a passion of mine. I mean, like, I think parenting is super fascinating, super frustrating, and really it's the thing that I spend most of my time thinking about and doing. I mean, I'm parenting my daughter quite often, mostly as a single parent. Basically, I'm a single mom 5 days a week, and so getting a lot of practice. And it's something I want to do a really good job of. Oh, I guess one thing I want to say is, in all the radical honesty workshops that I've done, the thing I come away with often is how much impact parents have on their kids. Like, we learn that so much in radical honesty work, right? Don't you think? I mean, it's like, I mean, I guess it goes without saying. It's pretty obvious, right? Parents have an impact on their kids. But we see the ins and outs of it, and the subtleties of it, and I don't know, I just think it's so fascinating, and I want to do a really good job of raising my daughter so that she has a chance of not having too much baggage. Like Brad always says, we gotta find a way to raise up our children without hurting them quite so much. But yeah.
So before we get into like kind of the core principles of radical parenting and radical honesty, I wanted to just have us talk a little bit about how we got into this. Were you into the ideas around kind of, I don't even know how to sum it up, but kind of, the non-interference and kind of this level of respect for your child? Were you into a lot of these ideas and principles before you had a child, or is a lot of it, has it grown as you've read books and gotten more steeped in thinking about parenting since Elsie Jane was born?
I don't think I thought about it much, really. I think I had natural inclinations towards, empathy and respect. And I guess as a teacher, being a violin teacher and viola teacher, that was my main experience with children, and I saw them as being very capable and what am I trying to say? I got interested as a teacher first, I guess, in like entering the mind of my student. Like, what is it that they do understand or don't understand, and where can I help them? And so rather than trying to do stuff to my student, right? Like, I'm the person who knows what's going on, and I'm gonna do stuff to you to make you better. I had the orientation more of sort of wanting to understand and observe and experiment. Yeah.
And you were already pretty steep in Suzuki method, which is the style of teaching you do. As you read Radical Parenting and gotten more into Radical Honesty, it sounds like you've seen more parallels between like Suzuki method and a lot of these principles that we've read about in the books we've been reading, and in Radical Parenting, or no?
I'm not so sure about that anymore. I love Suzuki, the Suzuki community, and I'm like I'm a less Suzuki teacher than some Suzuki teachers. I didn't grow up Suzuki myself, so I'm sort of like an alien to the club. I'm like a late bloomer. So yeah, there's some aspects that I think fit hand in hand, but yeah.
Well, I'll explain quickly how I came into it. I mean, I think I was raised on, a lot of values, including like this non-interference principle from Star Trek. Also, my favorite essay is just called Self-Reliance, from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson's the middle name of my son, who's about 6 months old now, Arlo Emerson Gerlaw. And for me, I like the idea of every human having autonomy and every human having the ability to kind of blaze their own path and express what's kind of like special inside of them, as opposed to being kind of indoctrinated or stamped to kind of look like the rest of society, and just like feeding I saw a great quote on someone's bumper today that's from Robin Williams that said something like, if you've only got like an ounce of weirdness, like do everything you can to hone and like express it or whatever. I'm misquoting that horribly, but the idea is I've always liked the idea of people just like being unique and being uniquely them, accepting themselves for who they are, accepting each other for who we are. And so I think those core principles really fit with radical parenting. And I had a nephew who's about to turn 16 right now. My first nephew. I now have 3 nephews. And I was so excited to like help co-parent as an uncle, and just like I've been excited about all my niece and nephew's birth, but the first one, is pretty special. And so I started reading books and everything, and eventually kind of wore out my welcome as a co-parent, and so then had to really refocus that energy into like writing these essays and reading and just putting together this kind of philosophy around parenting that was from that being interrupted. And now my relationship is pretty abnormal. I'm in some custody challenges, hoping to have as large a role in the life of my son as possible. So again, my kind of parenting passions and excitement is being a little bit interrupted, and so I'm able to funnel some of that energy into this podcast and reading more about parenting and being more deliberate. So I'm not just I think a lot of my natural inclinations would be great for children, but as I've read more of the books that we've been reading, I've realized, some of the things that just come naturally to me, might unintentionally impact my child in ways that I wouldn't want. So later we'll talk about those books, but let's just really quickly also say just kind of the core aim of radical honesty and radical parenting. I mentioned acceptance is a big piece of it, accepting reality as it is, accepting yourself as you are, accepting others as they are. That leads often to like a deeper level of connection. So a lot of this for me is about accepting ourselves, accepting our children as they are. It's about relating to each other as we are instead of through roles and acts, where we can really connect with each other and have a deeper level of connection with our children. Anything else you want to say about kind of the core values of radical parenting and radical honesty as you see it?
Yeah, right. To go along with what you were just talking about, to see things as they really are requires a great deal of work, I think. And I guess I see that as one of the core central parts of radical honesty is we're looking at our filters and our biases and the way that we interpret everything and then take that as reality. But it's not reality. It's our interpretation and our story and our judgment. So I think, like what you're saying about accepting ourselves as we are, accepting other people as they are, comes from being able to really see clearly, which means we practice the skill of noticing, of like really just seeing and noticing what is there before we add all of our stories and interpretations to it, which comes in real handy with children.
Yeah.
We have all these. Sorry.
In a future podcast, we'll be talking about Elevating Childcare from Janet Lansbury, which is a book that Kara just introduced me to, and a lot of parents think it is their job or a big part of their job to like impart these morals and values and worldviews, and I think radical parenting is about a shift away from that kind of moralism and a shift towards noticing what Kara was just saying, just kind of noticing the world as it is. And Janet Lansbury in her book talks a lot about sports casting, which is essentially just like being there with your child and just kind of like translating the experience of now into words, like describing
what you notice. Mm-hmm. And that's what radical honesty is.
Yeah. And we are kind of like meaning-making machines. We are moralizers. Kara, even when she was introducing why she wants to do this at the beginning, you said like, I want to be good at this. I want to do good. And
I'm really attached to like being the best possible parent I can be, which is wonderful in some ways, but I put a lot of pressure on myself and I suffer a lot, also because of it.
Yeah. And moving away even from like good and bad, I think is part of the goal, and accepting yourself and who you are and how you are, and that you do things that you think are really consistent with your goal, which is to raise a child who loves herself and to raise a child who experiences as much joy as possible and as little as suffering as possible, although suffering is part of life and is part of her experience and will be part of her experience. But I think it's about adjusting our behavior. For me, it's about adjusting my behavior and reflecting on the long-term impacts of my interactions with my child, not just the immediate goal. I need to get this diaper changed. I need to get to the store, and kind of elevating the long-term psychological impacts of the influence that we're having on our child. In a way that is in line with what our main goal is, which for me, again, is kind of maximizing joy and self-expression and minimizing kind of suffering and repression and oppression.
And I think about that, like the suffering thing, that the way to minimize suffering is to teach our kids and ourselves to not be afraid of pain, and to be willing to process, really roll out the red carpet, as Janet Lansbury says, for pain, grief, disappointment, frustration, anger, for all that stuff, being willing to experience, welcoming all that stuff, so that we can have it might be an intense and comfortable experience for a little while, and then we can move on with our lives and go on to the next experience, versus having these typical conditioned lives of sort of this low grade suffering that just kind of like, lives in our backpack all the time. That's how I would describe myself, I guess.
Yeah.
That's what I'm recovering from, I would say.
And will you give just a high level kind of overview of your idea of what just radical honesty, since we're going to be speaking so much and speaking to people. I even did an episode with Brad Blanton, the author of Radical Honesty and Radical Parenting, that'll come out later. Anything would you be willing to just kind of introduce radical honesty?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest definition is describing what you notice. I think we've already said most of it, really. So in order to describe what we notice, we have to, one, hone our skill of actually noticing and being able to pay attention to what is physically happening in our bodies, in our environment, and also what our thoughts and our minds are happening, and being able to observe those without adding a whole bunch of meaning to them and stories to them. And then being able to describe them out loud. So I think there's the skill of noticing, and there's also the skill of describing, in the being able to use concrete descriptive language in a way that communicates the most amount of information and detail in the least amount of words. And that's what one podcast we're going to do about children's books. And that's something I love about children's books, is what I consider good children's books are ones that are really descriptive and detailed and specific. And they're not like up here in abstract land, like with some kind of moralistic thing. I have some examples, both ones that I like and ones that I don't like. And and then there's this big piece in Radical Honesty about being with our experience. So when we're willing to notice something, being willing to simply be with what's happening in our bodies, in our environment, and that there's a spontaneous transformation that occurs when we do that. And we don't know what that's going to look like or what that's going to be, but that by opening ourselves to what is actually happening, we open ourselves to more intensity than we're used to, and possibly even more pain than we're used to, but also more joy and aliveness and creativity and that spontaneous transformation comes from being willing to experience sort of heightened states of what's the word?
Just sensation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, both Kara and I agree with the idea that a lot of us spend our lives kind of subconsciously avoiding certain sensations and certain experiences, and you don't realize how a lifetime of this kind of low level anxiety of avoidance is just so much worse than just experiencing this. Brad likes to say, when you experience your experience, it comes and goes. When you resist it, it persists. So, those are the core ideas of radical honesty. They'll get into the core ideas of radical parenting for sure.
And what's so cool about children is that they're really good at this naturally. Yeah. They're amazing noticers.
Train them out of it, whereas they could train us back into it. It's our
job to train them out of it and socialize them to be more like us.
Yeah. Suppress that anger, not in public, whatever. Yeah.
And I do think that there's a place. I'm not fully in the non-interference camp. I think there's a place for, coaching and teaching our kids, of course. Well, I say of course, but that's because I believe that. And that we can do that in a way that's supportive and helpful in helping our kids to become skillful without being avoidant or repressing anything.
Mm-hmm. Good. So, kind of a slight revision of I think what Brad and the Radical Honesty people had said is kind of like the stone tablets. I think that the core message of Radical Honesty, when I like to describe it, is that it's about getting out of our heads into our bodies and senses in order to really three things: free ourselves from the suffering that is caused by like ongoing pretending, hiding, withholding, or lying to people. That a lot of suffering and stress comes from lying. And that lying can be just acting out a role, can be pretending we're not frustrated when we are, can be pretending we're not, whatever. So that's first, free ourselves from that kind of stress and anxiety caused by pretending or hiding or withholding and lying, something children don't need to really be.
All types of avoiding.
Yeah. Second is connecting with other people more deeply, more authentically, more vulnerably, because we are expressing these things that are going on in our minds and bodies. So just more intimate and deep connections with others. And then third is this goal of shifting from being kind of a subconsciously avoidant, driven, reactive product of past experiences, moving into being a consciously motivated, proactive creator of the life we want. When we're not just avoiding re-experiencing something that we haven't resolved or processed in our past, when we've dealt with that kind of pain and whatever experiences have brought us in life, it really frees us to just move forward, to be here in the present and consciously move forward rather than, dragging that baggage around. So those are, for me, the core kind of ideas of radical honesty and also a lot of the core ideas of radical parenting.
That's beautiful. Thanks for bringing those up. That's from those pillars.
Mm-hmm. There's five kind of pillars, but they really just break down to those three.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Okay,
that's
so
what we want for our kids, right? We want our children to grow up into conscious creators rather than reactive victims who are just like trying to survive and avoid and try and recover from whatever they suffered in their childhood.
Yeah. Cool. So we're not going to get too much into it. I think we're going to read some books if you want to read them along with us or ahead of time. We're going to talk about Elevating Childcare by Janet Lansbury. We're going to talk about Unconditional Parenting by Alfie Kohn, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk by Adele Faber and Elaine Maslich. We're going to talk about Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. We're going to talk about a bunch of little kids' books. What are some of the children's books you want us to talk about?
Well, I just have a couple off my shelf. A couple of my recent favorites are Julian is a Mermaid and The Tin Forest. Mm-hmm. Also, pretty much anything by William Steig. I have Amos and Boris here. These are my favorites, not necessarily my daughter's favorites. Yeah, those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head.
Good. Yeah, and we're going to talk about some books that aren't related to parenting directly, but deal with the same issues of like just respecting our children as the people that they are and are becoming, as opposed to some kind of like piece of us that is now kind of like detached or something like that. And then we're going to talk about the book Radical Parenting, Brad's book. But we're not going to get into it today. This is just kind of a brief intro episode. I'm really glad you've joined us. I'm excited about kind of building a community of people. There's a radical parenting group on Facebook that we'd love for you to join. And you can follow and subscribe to see future ones. We'll also be broadcasting these live at Denver Open Media's radio station 92.9, 89.3 HD3 in Denver, Colorado. Also, you can listen to them live on the app at denver.open.media. Anything else you want to say before we go, Kara?
I'm good.
All right. Well, again, thank you for joining us. Please subscribe and stay tuned for episode number 2.
Thanks, everybody.